Normandy, summer of 1944. A Panther commander scans the hedgerow country through his cupola, watching a line of Shermans cross an open field 800 yards out. He has seen this before. He has done this before. The silhouettes are familiar, the range is comfortable, and every calculation in his training tells him the same thing. Those tanks cannot hurt him from here. He steadies his crew. He waits for the lead Sherman to present its flat hull side, and then one of them fires first. The round does not glance. It does not spark off the glacis and tumble into the dirt. It punches through the Panther's front armor as though the slope were not there, and the interior fills with light, heat, and fragmentation before anyone inside has time to understand what happened. The other Shermans scatter. Smoke rises, and somewhere in the burning wreck, the old certainty that distance meant safety dies in a fraction of a second. The question that will haunt German armored doctrine for the rest of the war begins right here. Why did this one Sherman behave differently? To understand what happened in that field, you have to understand what the German armored forces believed about themselves by 1944, and more importantly, what that belief was built on. It was not fantasy. It was not propaganda. It was arithmetic. The Panther tank, formerly the Panzerkampfwagen 5, entered mass production in 1943 as a direct response to the Soviet T-34, and it carried with it a philosophy that would reshape the battlefield in Western Europe. Its frontal glacis plate was 80 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, angled at 55 degrees from the vertical. That slope made the effective thickness roughly 140 millimeters against incoming fire. A standard Sherman 75 millimeter gun, the workhorse weapon of every Allied armored unit in France, could not penetrate that plate at any combat range. Not at 1,000 yards, not at 500, not at 200. It simply could not generate enough velocity to overcome the combination of thickness and angle. And the Panther's crew knew it. But armor was only half the equation. The Panther also carried the 75 millimeter KWK 42 L70 gun, a long-barreled, high-velocity weapon that could defeat the frontal armor of any Allied medium tank at ranges well beyond 1,000 meters. That reach created an asymmetry that defined every engagement in the bocage, the fields, and the open ground around Caen. A Panther could stand off at 800, 1,000, 1,200 meters, pick its targets, and fire with near impunity, knowing that the incoming rounds from Shermans would do nothing more than scar its paint. And so a logic took hold among German tank crews, not through arrogance, but through experience. If they could see a Sherman, they could kill it. If a Sherman could see them, it could not kill them. Distance was the Panther's ally, and every meter of open ground between the two tanks tilted the mathematics further in the German crew's favor. The Tiger one reinforced this. Psychology even more starkly. With 100 millimeters of flat frontal armor and the famous 88 millimeter gun, the Tiger could dominate engagements at extreme distances, where Allied tanks became little more than targets on a range. Tiger crews had learned this on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, in Sicily, and by the time they reached Normandy, that confidence was deeply embedded. The Tiger was rare. Only about 126 Panthers and Tigers were initially present among the roughly 2,300 German tanks deployed in Normandy. But their psychological weight was disproportionate. Every Allied tank crew had heard the stories. Every briefing mentioned the 88, and every engagement where a Sherman round bounced off heavy German armor at range confirmed the same lesson from both sides of the gun. The Germans held the firepower advantage, and they intended to keep it. This was not a static situation, it was an escalating one. By mid-1944, the Panther was no longer a rare curiosity. Intelligence analysis using serial numbers on captured vehicles had shown that German production of Panthers was far higher than anticipated. The Americans had expected Panthers to be a niche heavy tank, produced in small numbers like the Tiger. They were wrong. Panthers were becoming the backbone of German panzer regiments, deployed in formations of nearly 100 per regiment, alongside Panzer IVs and assault guns. In the planning for the Normandy invasion, the U.S. Army had expected to face a handful of heavy tanks and large numbers of older Panzer IVs. Instead, 38% of the German tanks in Normandy were Panthers, and their frontal armor could not be penetrated by the 75mm guns that almost every Sherman carried. This was the world that Allied tank crews entered on June 6, 1944. A world where their most common weapon was structurally incapable of defeating their most common enemy from the front. And inside every German turret that summer, there was a quiet, earned confidence that as long as they controlled the range, nothing on the Allied side could touch them. They were almost right. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. For the men inside the Shermans, the reality was grimmer than any briefing had prepared them for. They had crossed the English Channel, landed under fire, pushed inland through the dunes and seawalls, and shattered coastal villages. And within days they encountered an enemy whose armor they could not penetrate. It was not an abstract problem. It was a visceral one. You would fire your main gun, see the round strike, watch the spark in the dust cloud, and then realize the enemy tank was still there, still moving, still traversing its turret toward you. The round had done nothing, and now you had seconds. The standard M4 Sherman was not a bad tank. It was reliable. It was mechanically sound. Its 75mm gun was effective against infantry positions, soft targets, and the older German tanks that had dominated the earlier years of the war, the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, the Sturmgeschütz III. Against those vehicles, the Sherman had performed creditably in North Africa, and Italy and American doctrine had developed around its strengths: mobility, volume of fire, mechanical availability. The problem was that the doctrine assumed the Sherman would rarely face heavy armor head-on. American planners had believed tank destroyers, not tanks, would handle enemy armor. And so the urgency to upgun the Sherman had been delayed, debated, and ultimately deferred until it was too late to change the equation before Normandy. British crews faced the same gun but understood the problem earlier, because British experience in the desert and in Italy had exposed the vulnerability more directly. Crews from regiments that had fought in North Africa returned with a sharp awareness of what high-velocity anti-tank weapons could do to a Sherman, and they carried that awareness into the planning for the invasion. The gap between what the Sherman could deliver and what the enemy could absorb was not merely technical. It was emotional. A crew that fires and fails, fires again, and fails again begins to lose something harder to replace than ammunition. They lose the belief that their vehicle can protect them. And in armored warfare, that belief is the foundation of initiative. Without it, crews hesitate. They take fewer risks. They look for cover when they should be advancing. They begin to treat their own tank not as a weapon, but as a liability, a thin-skinned box that draws fire it cannot answer. The Sherman had another reputation that followed it into France, one that the men who crewed it rarely spoke about lightly. The early models had a tendency to burn when penetrated, a result of ammunition storage and the use of gasoline engines rather than diesel. The incidence was severe enough that the Germans gave the Sherman a grim nickname, one that translated roughly to a cigarette lighter, because it lit on the first strike. British and Canadian crews were acutely aware of this. The wet ammunition storage introduced on later models reduced the fire risk, but the reputation lingered, and reputation in war is its own kind of armor for the enemy and against the crew inside. When a man climbs into a tank that he believes will burn if hit, he fights with a different kind of fear than the man who believes his armor will hold. That fear does not make him a coward. It makes him human. And in the summer of 1944, a great many human beings were climbing into Shermans every morning, knowing that they might face a Panther or a Tiger before noon, and that their main gun could not save them if they did. The imbalance was not lost on commanders. Reports flowed back from the front describing engagements where multiple Shermans had been lost trying to destroy a single Panther. The exchange ratios were sobering. The mathematics that comforted German crews were the same mathematics that kept Allied tank commanders awake at night. And somewhere in England, months before the first landing craft touched Normandy sand, a small group of British engineers and officers had already begun working on the answer. They just had not told anyone yet. The problem was not that the British lacked a powerful anti-tank weapon. They had one. It had been in service since early 1943, and it had already proven itself in North Africa. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder was a 76.2 millimeter gun designed from the outset to destroy heavily armored tanks at long range. Its development had begun in 1941 when British planners correctly anticipated that German armor would continue to thicken and that the standard 6-pounder gun then entering service would become obsolete against the next generation of panzers. The specifications were ambitious. The gun had to penetrate at least 120 millimeters of armor at over 700 meters. The caliber was set at 3 inches, the projectile weighed 17 pounds, and the muzzle velocity was designed to exceed 900 meters per second. The result was a weapon that, in its towed configuration, could defeat the frontal armor of the Tiger I at standard engagement ranges. It was large. It was heavy. Its recoil was enormous. And it was, without question, the most effective anti-tank gun in the Allied arsenal. Reports from units equipped with the towed 17-pounder in Tunisia and Italy confirmed its potency. Officers in the Royal Armored Corps recognized that this gun could change the equation against Panthers and Tigers, and by 1943, crews in the field were specifically requesting that the 17-pounder be mounted in a tank. 144 tank crews formally stated that the 17-pounder should be mated with the Sherman. Montgomery himself acknowledged it, but having a gun and having a gun inside a tank are two very different things. The towed 17-pounder was effective precisely because it was large, sitting behind a heavy gun shield on a wheeled carriage with a crew of 7 to serve it and a day's worth of preparation time to dig it into a proper firing position. Putting that gun inside a tank turret where space was measured in inches and every component had to share room with a crew of 4 or 5 was a different proposition entirely. The British had tried. Their intended solution was the Challenger, a new cruiser tank based on a lengthened Cromwell hull with a turret large enough to house the 17-pounder. But the Challenger program had been plagued by delays, redesigns, and technical problems, and by late 1943 it was clear that very few Challengers would be ready for Normandy. Another option, the Cromwell itself, was ruled out when engineers discovered its turret ring was too narrow to accept even a smaller high-velocity weapon. The Cromwell would have to go to war with the standard 75mm gun, a weapon that could not penetrate a Panther's front. This left the British in a position that was uncomfortable but clarifying. They had the gun. They had no tank to put it in. They had a deadline that could not move because the invasion was coming whether the tank was ready or not. And sitting in depots across England were thousands of American-made Sherman tanks, reliable, available, and equipped with turrets that no one believed could possibly accommodate a gun as large as the 17-pounder. No one, that is, except a small number of officers and one particular engineer who thought the impossible was merely difficult. The idea of putting a 17-pounder inside a Sherman turret was not, in its earliest form, met with enthusiasm. The Ministry of Supply's Tank Decision Board rejected it. The reasoning was practical. The 17-pounder's breech was enormous. Its recoil system required a full meter of rearward travel after firing, and the Sherman turret had not been designed for anything close to that size. American ordnance officials were similarly skeptical. The gun was too big. The turret was too small. The physics did not add up. But 2 persistent British officers refused to accept that answer. The proposal had originated at the Royal Armoured Corps Gunnery School at Lulworth, championed by Major George Brighty of the Royal Tank Regiment, with support from the 79th Armored Division under Major General Percy Hobart, who had built his reputation on unconventional solutions to battlefield problems. Their advocacy kept the idea alive through bureaucratic resistance, and eventually the project received authorization for conversion trials. The man who turned the idea into a working prototype was W.G.K. Kilburn, a Vickers engineer assigned to the Department of Tank Design. The challenge he faced was not a simple retrofit. It was a fundamental rethinking of how the gun, the turret, and the crew would coexist inside a space that was never meant to hold them together. The first problem was the recoil. The 17-pounder traveled a full meter rearward after firing. The Sherman turret did not have a meter of space behind the breech. The gun would slam into the rear wall of the turret on every shot. Kilburn solved this not by modifying the existing recoil system, but by redesigning it entirely. He shortened the main recoil cylinders and repositioned them on both sides of the gun, exploiting the width of the turret rather than its depth. It was an elegant solution to a brutal constraint. Then came the breech. The standard 17-pounder opened from the top, which required the loader to stand above the gun to insert each round. Inside the cramped Sherman turret, there was no room for that motion. Kilburn rotated the entire gun breech 90 degrees so that it opened to the left instead of from above, allowing the loader to sit on the left side of the gun and feed rounds horizontally. This single modification changed the internal geometry of the turret completely. But solving the recoil and the breech created new problems. The radio, normally housed at the rear of the turret in British-configured Shermans, now had no room. Kilburn designed an armored box, a bustle, that was welded to the back of the turret to house the radio set, with access through a hole cut through the turret wall. This bustle also served as a counterweight for the gun, which had shifted the turret's center of gravity forward. A new mantelet had to be designed to protect the modified gun mount, adding 13 millimeters of additional armor to the front face. A new hatch had to be cut into the turret, roof above the gunner's position, because the larger breech now blocked the gunner's ability to escape through the commander's hatch, a critical concern for a vehicle whose crew might need to bail out under fire. The gun cradle, the metal block on which the gun sat, had to be shortened to fit the turret's interior, and this created stability problems that threatened the gun's accuracy. Kilburn addressed this by having a new barrel designed with a longer untapered section at its base, which improved the gun's seating and reduced wobble during firing. The modifications were so extensive that the resulting weapon was no longer a standard 17-pounder. It was a bespoke creation, a Mark IV variant of the gun, factory-built specifically for the Firefly. No other version would fit. No standard 17-pounder could be swapped in from a field depot. Every gun destined for a Sherman turret had to be manufactured to Kilburn's specifications from the start. There was also a cost that no engineering could eliminate. The co-driver, who sat in the front hull of a standard Sherman and operated a hull-mounted machine gun, had to go. His position was eliminated entirely, and his compartment was converted into ammunition storage space. The hull machine gun port was welded shut and covered with an armor plate. The crew was reduced from 5 to 4. The tank lost a set of eyes, a set of hands, and a machine gun. What it gained was the ability to kill a Tiger. The result was a vehicle that looked, from the outside, almost identical to a standard Sherman. The hull was the same. The profile was the same. The tracks, the engine deck, the overall silhouette were all unchanged. The differences were there if you knew where to look. The longer gun barrel, the small bustle on the rear of the turret, the welded-over hull gun port. But at battlefield distances, through the narrow optics of a German gun sight, at the speed of an engagement measured in seconds, those differences were easy to miss. And that, whether anyone planned it or not, would turn out to be the Firefly's most dangerous feature. The name came from the gun's behavior when fired. The 17-pounder used a large propellant charge, and the muzzle flash it produced was extraordinary, a brilliant, blinding burst of flame that could ignite hedgerows, set undergrowth burning, and temporarily blind both the gunner and the commander if they did not learn to blink at the instant of firing. Some accounts attribute the nickname to the detonation of residual propellant gases at the muzzle, creating a flickering flash that looked, from a distance, like the glow of a firefly in the dark. The name appeared in unit-level war diaries starting in March 1944, sometimes alongside the less common nickname Mayfly. Production began in January 1944. The urgency was absolute. The Challenger was delayed. The Cromwell could not accept a high-velocity gun. Winston Churchill himself gave the Firefly conversion the highest priority in the British arsenal. Factories in London, Manchester, and Nottingham were tasked with the work. The majority of conversions were performed on the Sherman 5, the British designation for the M4A4, of which the British had received approximately 7,200 through Lend-Lease. Some Sherman 1 models and Sherman 1 hybrids were also converted, as available vehicles were pulled from stocks. By May 31, 1944, 6 days before D-Day, 342 Sherman Fireflies had been delivered to the 21st Army Group. It was not enough, not nearly enough to equip every troop, every squadron, every regiment with the gun that could fight Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. But it was enough to begin, and the distribution model that emerged from this scarcity would shape the Firefly's entire combat identity. Each British tank troop would receive one Firefly alongside 3 standard Shermans armed with the 75mm gun. 1 in 4. The Firefly would be the only tank in the troop capable of penetrating heavy German armor from the front at typical combat ranges. The other 3 were there for infantry support, for suppressive fire, for engaging softer targets, but against a Panther or Tiger, they were effectively spectators. The single Firefly carried the entire anti-armor burden of its troop. This ratio was not a tactical choice. It was a production constraint. There were simply not enough Fireflies to distribute more generously. But it created something remarkable and unintentional, a hidden weapon. If a German tank commander spotted 4 Shermans moving across a field, he saw 4 of the same tank. He had no reason to believe one of them was fundamentally different from the other 3. He made his calculations based on what he knew about the 75mm Sherman, and those calculations told him he was safe at range. He was looking at a troop of Shermans, and every instinct, every experience, every after-action report he had ever read told him the same thing. Shermans could not hurt him at this distance. He was counting on uniformity, and uniformity was exactly what the Firefly broke. The invasion began before dawn on June 6, 1944, and the Firefly's war began not on the beaches, but at sea. 6 Fireflies were divided into pairs and assigned to DD tank regiments of the British 13th/18th Hussars at Sword Beach and the Canadian 1st Hussars and Fort Garry Horse at Juno Beach. Their role was coastal bombardment, firing from specially modified landing craft toward concrete fortifications during the run-in to the shore. It was an unusual debut for a weapon designed to kill tanks, but it reflected the improvisational nature of the entire invasion. The first non-DD tank regiment to land with Fireflies was the Staffordshire Yeomanry, which brought at least 12 Sherman VCs alongside 48 standard Sherman 3s. They came ashore in the chaos of the beachhead, rolling through cleared lanes in the obstacles, passing wrecked vehicles and scattered equipment, and pushing inland toward the assembly areas where the real fighting would begin. Little detailed information survives about the Firefly's performance during the opening days. The beachhead was confusion, units were mixed, objectives were delayed, and the kind of set-piece armored engagements that the Firefly was designed for had not yet fully materialized. But the Fireflies were there. mixed into every troop, indistinguishable at a distance, rolling through the same lanes and the same villages as the standard Shermans beside them. To the infantry they passed, to the naval observers offshore, to the reconnaissance aircraft overhead, they looked no different from any other Sherman on the beach. And to the German defenders watching from the ridgelines behind the coast, scanning the Allied columns with binoculars and rangefinders, they looked no different either. That invisibility was not by design. No one had painted the Firefly in special camouflage or given it a deceptive profile. It was simply a Sherman with a longer gun, and at the distances at which the first encounters were taking place, that distinction was subtle. The 1 in 4 distribution meant that most of what the Germans saw was exactly what they expected: standard 75mm Shermans. The Firefly hid in plain sight, surrounded by vehicles that confirmed the enemy's assumptions. It was, in a sense, the most effective form of deception. Not a clever trick, but an honest appearance that happened to conceal something lethal. In the days immediately following D-Day, the Fireflies began to work their way into the line. Troops that included them moved south from the beaches toward the contested ground around Bayeux, toward the hedgerow country beyond the coastal plain, and toward the city that would become the axis around which the entire Normandy campaign rotated: Caen. The Germans were reinforcing, bringing panzer divisions forward from their reserve positions, and the armored battles that everyone had anticipated were about to begin. The question that no German tank commander had yet been forced to ask was about to be answered in the worst possible way, at 800 yards without warning through the front of his hull. The first shock engagements of the Normandy campaign established a pattern that would repeat itself across the bocage and the open fields south of Caen for the next 3 months. German armor would advance or take up defensive positions, confident in the range advantage. Allied Shermans would appear. German crews would observe, calculate, and prepare to engage, knowing that the incoming fire could not penetrate their frontal armor at any meaningful distance. And then a round would arrive from a direction and distance that made no sense. The area around Villers-Bocage, 12 miles southwest of Caen, became one of the early flashpoints. British forces, including the veteran 7th Armored Division, attempted to outflank the German defenses in a sweeping move that brought them into contact with elements of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tiger I tanks. The resulting battle, fought on June 13, 1944, was devastating for the British, as a single Tiger commander exploited the narrow roads and surprise disposition of the British column to destroy multiple vehicles in rapid succession. The action at Villers-Bocage became a symbol of everything the Allies feared about German heavy armor: surprise, firepower, and the agonizing futility of returning fire with weapons that could not penetrate. But within that same battle, the counter-narrative was already being written. A Sherman Firefly of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, commanded by Sergeant Stan Lockwood, was positioned at the western end of the village when the Tiger appeared. The Tiger's turret was traversed to fire into a side street, presenting a moment of vulnerability. Lockwood's crew engaged from approximately 200 meters, firing 4 17-pounder rounds. One struck the Tiger's hull and produced a jet of flame. This was not a defeat of the Tiger in the open, at range, in the kind of engagement that would later define the Firefly's reputation. It was close, chaotic, and opportunistic. But it established a critical fact. The 17-pounder could do what the 75 could not. It could reach inside a Tiger and make it burn. The larger pattern emerged in the weeks that followed, as Fireflies were integrated into the sustained fighting around Caen and the creeping advance through the Norman countryside. A troop of 4 Shermans would encounter a Panther hull-down behind a hedgerow at 700 or 800 yards. The standard Shermans would engage, their rounds sparking uselessly off the sloped glacis. And then the Firefly would fire. The round, propelled at over 900 meters per second by the 17-pounder's massive charge, would arrive with a velocity and energy that the Panther's crew had never associated with a Sherman. The penetration would be clean, catastrophic, and utterly disorienting to any German crew observing from nearby, because what they had just witnessed should not have been possible. That was not how Shermans worked. That was not what that gun was supposed to do. The confusion was real, and it would grow. After-action reports from German units in Normandy during June and July 1944 began to reflect a dissonance that had no ready explanation within their existing framework. Tanks were being destroyed at ranges where they should have been safe. Penetrations were occurring through armor faces that should have defeated any round a Sherman could fire. German intelligence officers noted the anomalies and attempted to classify them. Some reports described the damage as consistent with a heavier gun, possibly a new Allied tank type that had not yet been identified. Others speculated about a new variant of anti-tank gun being used in a concealed position behind the Sherman screen. The confusion was compounded by the Firefly's appearance. German tank commanders were accustomed to identifying Allied vehicles at range by silhouette. A Sherman was a Sherman. It had a particular profile, a particular turret shape, a particular barrel length. The Firefly's barrel was noticeably longer than a standard 75mm gun, but at the distances where most engagements occurred, that difference was not always apparent, especially when the tank was partially obscured by terrain, foliage, or smoke. The armored bustle on the turret rear was a distinguishing feature, but it faced away from the enemy and was only visible from behind or in profile. From the front, where the threat assessment mattered most, the Firefly looked like a Sherman. And that was the problem for German commanders who were trying to understand why their armor was suddenly failing. The psychological impact was disproportionate to the numbers involved. There were not many Fireflies in Normandy. The initial complement of 342 at D-Day grew as additional conversions were delivered through June and July, but at any given moment, the number of Fireflies in the line was a fraction of the total Allied tank strength. Yet their effect rippled outward because they violated an assumption that underpinned German tactical confidence. If one Sherman in 4 could kill a Panther at 800 yards, then every Sherman in the field was potentially dangerous because you could not tell which one carried the lethal gun until it fired. And by then, it was too late. This uncertainty was a new experience for German armored crews who had spent 2 years building their engagements around a reliable model of Allied capability. They knew how far a Sherman could shoot. They knew what it could penetrate. They knew what range they needed to maintain to remain invulnerable. The Firefly erased that model, not by changing every Sherman, but by changing the possibility of what any Sherman might be. One tank in a troop had redefined the threat of the entire troop, and the German response, when it came, would confirm that the message had been received. The Germans adapted quickly because in armored warfare, the cost of not adapting was measured in burning hulls. Once field commanders identified that certain Shermans carried a longer gun capable of defeating Panthers and Tigers at range, the tactical response was immediate and ruthless. Target the long-barreled Shermans first. Every German tank commander, every anti-tank gun crew, every infantry observer equipped with a field radio received the same priority instruction. If you see a Sherman with a long barrel, kill it before it fires. Everything else is secondary. This created an inversion that the Firefly crews felt immediately. The tank that had been designed to protect the troop by providing the only effective anti-armor weapon was now the most targeted vehicle on the battlefield. The Germans did not need to destroy all 4 Shermans in a troop. They needed to destroy one. And with the Firefly gone, the remaining 3 Shermans were, against heavy armor, functionally unarmed. The priority targeting turned the Firefly from a hidden advantage into a marked target, and crews began to die at rates that reflected their exposure. The response came from the crews themselves, improvised, tested, and refined in the field. The most common method was barrel camouflage. Crews painted the forward half of the 17-pounder's long barrel with white counter shading on the underside, using a wavy border pattern designed to break up the shadow that made the gun so visually distinctive. The intent was to make the barrel appear shorter from a distance, mimicking the shadow profile of the standard 75mm gun. A false muzzle brake, often made from wood or papier-mâché, was fitted approximately halfway along the barrel, positioned at the same distance from the turret as the muzzle of a 75mm gun. The combination was designed to create the illusion that the barrel ended where a normal Sherman's barrel would end, while the remaining length, counter-shaded in white, faded against the sky. A second, more radical method was also proposed. The turret would be reversed so the long barrel pointed rearward, and a dummy 75mm gun would be mounted on the turret bustle to point forward, making the Firefly appear to be a standard Sherman traveling in the correct orientation. The real barrel would be concealed in foliage laid across the engine deck. A commission reviewed both methods. They approved the counter shading. The dummy barrel idea received mixed reactions because driving toward the enemy with your main gun pointed the wrong way was, to put it mildly, a difficult sell to crews who might need to fire within seconds. Nevertheless, at least 50 dummy barrels were produced, and 24 were installed on tanks. Whether the camouflage actually saved Fireflies is difficult to determine. Loss records from the 21st Army Group between June 1944 and February 1945 show that standard Shermans were lost at a rate of approximately 12.6% of total strength per month, while Firefly losses averaged 6.2%. The lower rate likely reflects not just camouflage, but also how Fireflies were employed, held back, protected by their troopmates, positioned in overwatch, rather than leading advances. Commanders understood the value of their single Firefly and fought to keep it alive because losing it meant losing the only weapon that could answer heavy German armor. The camouflage was part of that effort, but the deeper truth was that survival depended less on what the barrel looked like and more on where the tank was standing when the shooting started. The tactical employment of the Firefly evolved rapidly in the weeks following D-Day, driven not by doctrine manuals written in England, but by the harsh education of sustained combat. The initial deployment treated the Firefly as simply another member of the troop, advancing alongside its 3 companion Shermans in whatever formation the troop leader chose. This worked when the enemy was infantry, or when the target was a Panzer IV at moderate range. It did not work when the troop encountered a Panther in a prepared position at 800 yards, because in that scenario, sending the Firefly forward with the rest of the troop exposed the only capable anti-armor weapon to the first volley of return fire. The adjustment was intuitive and arrived organically across multiple units within weeks. The Firefly began to hang back. Not far, 100 yards, 200 yards. Enough to remain within supporting distance, but outside the immediate envelope of the initial engagement. The 3 standard Shermans became the advance element, pushing forward, drawing fire, identifying enemy positions. The Firefly positioned itself in overwatch, scanning the terrain ahead through its gun sight, waiting for a target that justified the risk of revealing its position. When a Panther or Tiger was identified, the Firefly would fire from its offset position, engaging at range while the standard Shermans maneuvered to keep the enemy's attention divided. This was not a formal doctrine shift. No field manual was rewritten overnight. But across the regiments and brigades of the 21st Army Group, the same conclusion was reached independently, again and again. The Firefly was not a brawler. It was a precision instrument. It worked best when it could choose its moment, fire from a position of advantage, and relocate before the enemy could identify and target the source. In this sense, the Firefly functioned less like a tank and more like a sniper rifle on tracks. Its crew operated under a different set of rules than the crews of the standard Shermans beside them. They were not expected to close with the enemy. They were expected to kill the most dangerous thing on the battlefield from as far away as possible, and then move before the next round came back. The 17-pounder's characteristics reinforced this approach. The gun produced an enormous muzzle blast that kicked up a cloud of dirt and smoke in front of the tank, blinding the gunner and marking the Firefly's position with a signature that was visible for hundreds of yards. The gunner could not observe his own shot. He had to rely on the commander, watching from the cupola, to spot the fall of the round and call corrections. After firing, the Firefly had to move because its position was compromised. The rate of fire was slower than a standard Sherman's because loading the 17-pounder's large rounds in the cramped turret was physically demanding. Every shot counted more, every miss cost more, and every hit was worth more because a single 17-pounder round through a Panther's glacis could change the shape of an entire engagement. Commanders adapted their reconnaissance accordingly. Before a battle, troop leaders and squadron commanders began scouting the terrain for good overwatch positions, locations with clear fields of fire, solid cover, and easy withdrawal routes. These positions were chosen specifically for the Firefly, which would be placed there before the engagement began, its barrel trained on the most likely avenue of enemy approach. The standard Shermans would then advance along their planned routes, knowing that somewhere behind and to the flank, the Firefly was watching. Waiting, ready to reach out and touch something that no other tank in the troop could hurt. It was a quiet kind of power. No one outside the troop saw it happen. No dramatic charge, no sweeping maneuver. Just a gun that fired from a tree line at something moving 800 yards away. And that something stopped moving. The 17-pounder was already a formidable weapon with its standard ammunition, the armor-piercing, capped, ballistic-capped round, or APCBC, which could penetrate approximately 140 millimeters of armor at 500 meters and 131 millimeters at 1,000 meters when striking at a 30-degree angle. This was sufficient to defeat the Tiger I's frontal armor at typical engagement distances and to threaten the Panther's glacis at shorter ranges. But the British had been developing something more. Armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, designated APDS, represented a fundamental advance in anti-tank projectile design. Instead of firing a full-caliber steel shot, the APDS round used a smaller, denser tungsten carbide core wrapped in a lightweight sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The result was a projectile that was lighter, faster, and could penetrate far more armor than a conventional round of the same caliber. With APDS, the IE 17-pounder could penetrate approximately 233 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. That figure was staggering. It was enough to defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger II, the heaviest tank the Germans had deployed. It exceeded the penetration capability of the German 88mm KWK-43 gun using standard ammunition. The 17-pounder firing APDS from inside a Sherman turret was penetrating more armor at 1,000 meters than the most feared German tank gun. APDS was not available on D-Day itself. Most sources agree that it reached Normandy in increasing quantities by late June or early July 1944, in time for the major battles that would define the breakout phase of the campaign. Its arrival changed the mathematics of armored engagement once more because it eliminated the last refugee of the Panther crew, the belief that the steep slope of their glacis plate would defeat any round coming from a Sherman-type vehicle. With standard APCBC, a Firefly could threaten a Panther's front at close range. With APDS, it could penetrate at 1,000 meters or more, well within the comfort zone that Panther commanders had relied on for safety. There were limitations. The APDS round suffered from accuracy problems at longer ranges caused by inconsistent separation of the sabot as it left the barrel. The muzzle brake aperture was too small to allow a clean separation every time, and the result was a dispersion pattern that was wider than the standard APCBC round, at distances beyond 500 yards. Crews also reported that the smaller tungsten core tended to fragment after penetration, causing less internal damage to the enemy vehicle than a full-caliber round. And APDS was supplied in small quantities, typically comprising only about 6% of a Firefly's ammunition load, reserved for the hardest targets at the most critical moments. But even in small numbers, the existence of APDS changed the terms of the engagement. It was the difference between a weapon that could threaten heavy armor and a weapon that could guarantee its destruction. German tank commanders did not know which round was coming toward them. They only knew that the old safe distances were no longer safe. And that uncertainty, layered on top of every other uncertainty the Firefly had already introduced, was eroding the foundation on which German armored confidence was built. The change did not announce itself with a single battle or a dramatic reversal. It settled in gradually, like fog filling a valley, until one morning the German armored crews looked out at the same terrain they had dominated weeks earlier, and found that their instincts were telling them something different. Where they once advanced, they now paused. Where they once held position with confidence, they now requested reconnaissance before committing. Where they once trusted their armor to hold at 800 meters, they now wondered whether the next Sherman in the tree line might carry the gun that could reach through their glacis and into the fighting compartment before they had time to traverse. Hesitation in armored warfare is not a tactical adjustment. It is a symptom. It is the behavioral expression of a confidence that has been damaged, and once it takes hold, it propagates through a formation faster than any operational order. A Panther crew that pauses an extra 3 seconds before cresting a ridge has not made a rational calculation. It has absorbed, through experience and through the accounts of other crews, the knowledge that the old rules no longer apply. That 3-second pause may save the crew, or it may cost them the initiative that would have won the engagement. Either way, it is a concession. It is an acknowledgement that the ground between them and the enemy is no longer reliably safe. German armored tactics in Normandy relied on maintaining the initiative. The Panther and Tiger were offensive weapons when used correctly, designed to engage at range, destroy the enemy before they could close, and use the resulting shock to prevent organized resistance. This required advancing into positions of advantage, firing quickly, and relocating before the enemy could coordinate a response. Hesitation broke this cycle. A Panther that sat behind a hedgerow, waiting for more information before advancing, was a Panther that was not firing, not moving, not contributing to the tempo of the attack. And in the attritional grind of Normandy, where every day brought more Allied tanks ashore while German reinforcements grew thinner, tempo was the one resource the Germans could not afford to lose. The Firefly did not cause this hesitation alone. It was part of a broader calculus that included Allied air superiority, naval gunfire, the relentless flow of replacement vehicles, and the cumulative wear on German units that had been fighting without adequate rest or reinforcement since June. But the Firefly contributed something that no amount of artillery or air power could replicate. It made the enemy doubt his armor. Artillery could suppress, airstrikes could destroy. But neither of those threats challenged the fundamental premise that a Panther was safe from tank fire at range. The Firefly did. And once that premise was gone, the psychological architecture that supported aggressive German armored tactics began to fracture. Reports from German prisoners and captured documents reflected the shift. Tank commanders described engagements where they had been penetrated from distances they considered safe. Some attributed the kills to new heavy tanks. Some attributed them to anti-tank guns positioned behind the Sherman screen. Very few at first understood that the rounds had come from a vehicle that looked exactly like the tanks they had spent years learning to dismiss. The dissonance was unsettling because a threat you cannot identify is a threat you cannot plan against. Operation Total Eyes, launched on August 8, 1944, became the defining proof of what the Firefly could do when the tactical stars aligned. The offensive was a Canadian-led thrust south of Caen, aimed at breaking through the German defensive positions and opening the road to Falaise. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, part of the 33rd Armoured Brigade, reached the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Craminel in the early morning hours after a night march. A squadron and C Squadron moved into the Dell de la Roque Wood, with a squadron taking up positions along the southern edge and 3 troops positioned on the western side, overlooking a large open field. What happened next unfolded in minutes. German tanks advanced from the town of Cinto along the Route Nationale 158. Among them were Tiger I tanks of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, one of the most experienced and feared German heavy tank units in Normandy. The troop commander held fire as the Tigers approached, letting them come within 800 yards before committing. The gunner of the troop's Firefly, a trooper who had joined the regiment as a volunteer from a shoe factory in Northamptonshire and had barely fired the 17-pounder in training, engaged the rearmost Tiger first. 2 rounds. The Tiger was hit and began to burn. He traversed to the next target. 1 round, then a second to confirm. The second Tiger was destroyed. Then the third, under heavy surrounding fire from other units, was engaged and knocked out. 3 Tigers in approximately 12 minutes, fired from a concealed position at a range that no standard Sherman could have threatened. The action at Saint-Aignan-de-Craminel was significant, not just for the 3 Tigers destroyed, but for who was inside one of them. Though it was not known at the time and remains debated by historians, the engagement is widely believed to have resulted in the death of SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of the most decorated German tank commanders of the war, credited with the destruction of over 100 Allied vehicles. Wittmann had led the devastating attack at Villers-Bocage 2 months earlier that had shattered a British column and cemented the Tiger's fearsome reputation. That he may have met his end at the hands of a Firefly gunner who had fired his gun in combat for the first time that day encapsulated the entire Firefly story in a single, brutal irony. The most feared German tank commander, killed by the most ordinary-looking Allied tank in an engagement he did not see coming. The broader Normandy breakout that followed through late July and August saw the cumulative effect of the Firefly's presence. German armored counterattacks, which had been fierce and effective in the early weeks, lost cohesion as the campaign wore on. The reasons were manifold: fuel shortages, air interdiction, loss of experienced crews, the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. But woven through all of those factors was a quieter erosion. The inability to trust that distance and armor would protect them from tank fire. Every engagement carried a new risk. Every Sherman might be the one that could kill them. And in a campaign where German armor was already stretched beyond its limits, that additional uncertainty weighed more heavily with each passing day. From D-Day in June to the end of the Battle of Normandy in late August, nearly 400 additional Fireflies were converted and delivered to the front. By October 1944, supply to the Normandy theater was satisfied, and Fireflies began to be allocated to the Italian front and shared among Polish, Canadian, New Zealand, British, and South African regiments. The total production of Sherman Fireflies would eventually reach between 2,100 and 2,200 vehicles, making it the most numerous Allied vehicle to carry the 17-pounder during the war. It was not a mass-production wonder weapon. It was a conversion performed in 4 factories, using a gun that barely fit inside a turret that was never designed for it. But it was enough. Given what it accomplished, the Sherman Firefly should be one of the most recognizable tanks of the Second World War. It is not. It occupies a strange position in the popular memory of the conflict, overshadowed by the vehicles it fought alongside and the enemies it was built to destroy. Part of this obscurity is structural. The dominant narrative of the war in Western Europe, as told in post-war decades, was overwhelmingly American, and the Sherman Firefly was a British modification. American accounts centered on the challenges faced by the 75 and 76 millimeter Shermans, the debates about tank destroyer doctrine, and the late arrival of the M26 Pershing. The Firefly, which served with British, Canadian, Polish, and other Commonwealth forces, appeared in American accounts only peripherally, if at all. Part of the obscurity was visual. The Firefly looked like a Sherman. That was its tactical advantage and its historical curse. The Tiger one was unmistakable, massive, angular, a visual icon of mechanized power. The Panther had a distinctive sloped silhouette that set it apart from everything else on the battlefield. Even the standard Sherman was recognizable by its rounded hull and compact turret. The Firefly's distinguishing feature, its longer barrel, was subtle enough to be invisible in photographs taken at any distance, and in most images from the war, it is genuinely difficult to tell a Firefly from a standard Sherman without looking closely at the gun and the turret bustle. For a vehicle to become famous, it helps to look different. The Firefly deliberately looked the same. There was also a conceptual problem. The Firefly was not new. It was a conversion of an existing tank using an existing gun, achieved through engineering ingenuity rather than industrial revolution. It did not roll off a secret production line. It was not the product of a dramatic technological leap. It was the result of a Vickers engineer finding clever ways to make a gun fit where it should not have fit, and factories bolting the results onto American-built chassis that were already in the supply chain. That kind of story, pragmatic, incremental, unglamorous, does not generate the same narrative energy as the debut of a new superweapon. But it was arguably more impressive because it happened under pressure, against institutional resistance, with a deadline that could not be moved, and it worked. The men who crewed the Fireflies did not seek recognition for their vehicle. They were tank crews doing a job, and many of them did not survive long enough to see the war's end. The ones who did went home and returned to the lives they had left behind, to shoe factories and farms and offices, carrying with them an experience that most of their neighbors would never understand. The Firefly's legacy was not carried in parades or memorials. It was carried in the quiet knowledge that one summer in France, one ordinary-looking tank had changed what was possible on a battlefield, and that the men who crewed it had known every time they climbed inside that they were the highest priority target for every German gun in range. The real weapon was never the gun. It was never the tungsten core of the APDS round, or the redesigned recoil system, or the 90-degree rotation of the breech. Those were mechanisms. They were necessary, but they were not sufficient. The real weapon was the destruction of a belief. Armored warfare in the Second World War was built on assumptions. The assumption that thicker armor meant survival. The assumption that a longer gun meant dominance. The assumption that the enemy's capability could be predicted by the silhouette of his vehicle, and that once you had calibrated your tactics to that capability, the calibration would hold. These assumptions were not irrational. They were derived from experience, from training, from the accumulated data of thousands of engagements across multiple fronts and multiple years. And for most of the war, they held. The Tiger crew that sat at 1,000 meters and fired at Shermans with impunity was not being reckless. He was applying a model that had been validated by every engagement he had survived. The Firefly did not defeat the model by being superior to it. The Firefly was not better armored than a Panther. It was not faster. It was not more reliable. It carried less ammunition than a standard Sherman. Its turret was more cramped. Its gun produced blinding flash and choking smoke. Its rate of fire was slower. In every measurable category except one, the Firefly was an inferior or equivalent vehicle. But that one category, the ability to penetrate heavy armor at standard engagement ranges, was the category that mattered. Because it was the category on which the entire German tactical model depended. When that single capability appeared inside a vehicle that could not be distinguished from the standard vehicles the model had already accounted for, the model broke. Not because every Sherman was now dangerous, only 1 in 4 was, but because the Germans could not tell which one, and so every Sherman became potentially dangerous, and potential danger in the calculus of combat is treated as real danger. The Panther commander who once advanced confidently toward a line of Shermans at 800 meters now had to ask himself a question he had never asked before. Is one of those the one that can kill me? And the act of asking that question, the fraction of a second it consumed, the hesitation it introduced, the caution it imposed, was itself a weapon more powerful than any single round. This is what the Firefly really did. It did not outnumber the Panthers. The production figures were comparable in scale, with roughly 2,100 Fireflies against the thousands of Panthers built between 1943 and 1945. It did not outperform them in any direct sense. What it did was outmatch their assumptions. It introduced an exception into a rule that had governed German armored tactics since the Tiger first appeared on the Eastern Front. And in a system built on rules, a single exception is enough to cause systemic doubt. Doubt is the most corrosive force in combat. It does not destroy vehicles. It does not kill crews. But it slows the decisions of commanders. It widens the margins of caution in crews who can no longer trust their protection. And it shifts the initiative from the side that attacks to the side that waits. In Normandy, the Firefly helped shift that initiative at a moment when the Germans could least afford to lose it. Not through overwhelming force, not through dramatic breakthrough, but through the quiet, relentless erosion of a myth that had kept German tank crews fighting as though they were untouchable. The myth died one Panther at a time, one Tiger at a time, one 17-pounder round at a time, fired from a tank that nobody recognized until it was too late. Return to that field in Normandy. The summer light is flat and heavy. The air smells of cordite, diesel, and the wet green of crushed grass. A column of smoke rises from a Panther that will never move again, its crew either dead inside or scattered in the ditch beside the hedgerow. 800 yards away, a Sherman is already reversing into the tree line, its long barrel trailing behind it, like a secret being withdrawn from view. The other 3 Shermans in the troop are still in the open, their 75mm guns traversing, scanning for targets, but the kill belongs to the tank that is now disappearing, the one that looked like the others, the one that was not. Somewhere in the command chain of a German panzer regiment, a report is being filed. A Panther was destroyed at a range that the reporting officer notes should not have been possible from a Sherman. The round penetrated the upper glacis. The angle should have defeated it. The range should have saved them. Neither did. The officer speculates about a new Allied tank type. He recommends additional reconnaissance before future advances across open ground. He does not know the name Firefly. He does not know that the gun was a British weapon squeezed into an American turret by an engineer from Vickers who was told the task was impossible and did it anyway. He only knows that something has changed and that the old rules, the rules that kept his crews alive, may no longer apply. This is the moment that matters. Not the engineering, not the production figures, not the penetration tables. The moment that matters is the one where a commander on the other side stops trusting his armor. Because once that trust is gone, everything that follows is different. He moves slower. He positions more conservatively. He waits for intelligence that may never come before he commits to an advance that used to be routine. And in a campaign defined by attrition, by the relentless pressure of an enemy that could replace its losses faster than he could replace his, that slowness is fatal. Not in a single battle, over weeks. Over the long grinding summer, when the bocage gives way to the breakout, and the breakout gives way to the pursuit, and the pursuit carries the war all the way to the Rhine. The Sherman Firefly never became famous. It was never meant to be. It was a stopgap, a field modification, a desperate answer to a problem that should have been solved by tanks that were never ready in time. It served from June 1944 until the end of the war, carried the heaviest psychological burden of any tank in the Commonwealth arsenal, and disappeared into history as quickly as it had appeared on the battlefield. The men who crewed it went home. The factories that built it stopped converting Shermans and moved on. The gun that made it lethal was superseded within years by larger, more modern weapons. And the Panther and Tiger, the tanks it was built to kill, became icons of military history, remembered and modeled and debated by generations of enthusiasts who could identify them at a glance. But the Firefly remains, not as an icon, as a lesson. The lesson is simple, and it applies far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy. In armored warfare, the most dangerous weapon is not the one with the thickest armor or the longest gun. It is the one you do not recognize until it fires, because by then the only thing left to do is burn.